Us tell stories. We tell the ones that matter. A black farmer walks into court to defend the land his family has owned for over a century, only to be mocked by the judge for the way he speaks. But when he pulls out a letter written by her own grandfather, the entire courtroom, and the country, goes silent. What did that letter say that changed everything? What do you think would have happened if he hadn't spoken up? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true stories that hit the heart. Now, let's take you back to that quiet Missouri morning. It was 6:04 in the morning when Isaiah Freeman stood in front of the bathroom mirror, barefoot, still half wrapped in the scent of cedar soap and stove ash. The glass was cracked at the corner, but clear enough for him to see what mattered. A face carved by time and sunlight. A silver beard that he trimmed himself every Saturday. Eyes that had seen both drought and betrayal, and yet never stopped looking forward. He buttoned up his flannel shirt, one he'd worn so thin it remembered the shape of his back. Then he reached down, tugged on a pair of scuffed-up boots. Soil still clung to the soles. His soil. He stared at his reflection for a long moment. Then, in a quiet voice meant only for the walls, he said, "This ain't about the land. It's about them thinking, I don't know how to stand tall." Downstairs, the wood stove popped in protest against the early chill. Helen Freeman, his wife of 42 years, was already in motion, moving with that graceful quiet born from decades of early mornings. She poured 2 cups of coffee, hers with cream, his straight black, always had been. Isaiah sat at the small kitchen table, calloused hands wrapped around the warm mug. Out the window, the sun hadn't quite risen, but the land was there, waiting. 110 acres of Missouri earth, flat, open, sacred. Guarded by an old oak tree at the edge of the west field, where his father once taught him to shoot a .22 rifle and plant tomatoes in the same season. It wasn't just property. It was proof. Proof that his people had once clawed their way from nothing and claimed something real. His great-grandfather, Elijah Freeman, had bought that land in 1872, fresh out of bondage. No schooling, no rights, just a shovel, a borrowed mule, and a will too stubborn for chains. He saved up every coin fixing fences and laying railroad track, until one day he walked into a county office and signed for 110 acres, with an X. Didn't even know how to read the deed, but he knew it was his. Isaiah still had that deed, folded in a worn envelope, still carried the scent of chimney smoke and old cotton. To him, that land was more than inheritance. It was the first thing his family had ever owned that couldn't be taken by whip or whim. Now they wanted it. Some energy developer, backed by men in suits with soft hands, had teamed up with the local council to seize his farm under the label of community progress. Solar panels, tax incentives, eminent domain, no warning. Just a letter in the mailbox and a check that looked generous to people who'd never had to bury a father beneath the same soil he once plowed. They called it just business. But to Isaiah, it felt like history trying to steal itself back. Helen set a plate of toast down beside him, then rested her hand on his shoulder. "Speak the way you always do, Zay," she said softly. "That's how truth sounds best." Isaiah looked up at her and gave a small nod, eyes heavier than usual. Then he reached for the worn brown folder on the counter. Inside was the deed, the maps, and one letter that hadn't seen daylight in over 80 years. Outside, the sound of a car horn echoed up the gravel drive. Nia Freeman was already waiting by the truck. 22 years old, law student, smart, sharp-eyed, and already too tired of watching her father fight battles he shouldn't have to fight. She tapped the roof as he climbed in, asked gently, "You ready, Daddy?" He adjusted the brim of his hat, stared down the long road toward the courthouse, and answered, "I was born ready. Just didn't think I'd still need to be." The truck pulled away, dust lifting behind them like smoke from a slow-burning fire. And as the morning unfolded over fields that still remembered their first plow, Isaiah Freeman went not to reclaim a title, but to defend a legacy carved into soil, sweat, and silence. The Claiborne County Courthouse wasn't much to look at, just 4 aging columns, chipped brick, and a front door that stuck in the summer. But this morning, it stood tall like a gate to something heavier than law. Something like judgment. Inside, the courtroom was full. Not with reporters or flashing cameras, just townsfolk, clerks, a few curious neighbors, and a group of high school interns lined up in the back, clutching their notebooks like shields. The room smelled faintly of old wood, dust, and whatever was left from the bailiff's morning coffee. Isaiah took a seat at the plaintiff's table. No attorney beside him. Just a worn folder, a bottle of water, and a letter in a clear sleeve he hadn't let out of his sight in years. Naya sat behind him in the gallery, eyes locked forward, hands folded tight in her lap. Her jaw clenched when she saw the nameplate on the bench. Han, Madeline Rowe. 48 years old, white. Yale Law, class of '99. Reputation, brutally efficient, sharply spoken, allergic to drama as she liked to call it. She walked in wearing a robe so perfectly pressed it looked like it had never been sat in. Her hair, pulled into a severe bun, didn't move when she did. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't have to. With a nod, she called the session to order. Then she glanced at the case summary on her monitor and let out a breath that wasn't quite a sigh, just enough to signal this wasn't a priority on her docket. "Mr. Isaiah Freeman," she said, voice crisp as cold steel. "You may proceed." Isaiah stood. Not quickly, not slowly, just steady. He didn't unfold a speech, he didn't clear his throat, he didn't ask for permission. He just stepped forward, placed both hands on the podium, and began. "Your Honor, I ain't got lawyer words, but I got truth. This land." He didn't get any further. Judge Rowe blinked, once slowly, then looked over at her clerk, lips twitching in what might have been amusement. And then she said it. Clear, loud, unapologetic. "Mr. Freeman, are we in a courtroom or auditioning for Southern Baptist Story Hour?" For a second, no one breathed. Then, a few scattered chuckles, nervous, awkward, but real. The kind of laughter people give when they don't know what else to do. In the back, one of the high school interns looked down at their shoes. Another scribbled something furiously, as if writing would make it disappear. Nia's fingers dug into the fabric of her blazer. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her father hadn't even flinched. Isaiah didn't look angry. He didn't protest. He didn't look down. He just looked straight ahead, eyes steady, shoulders still. Then, in a tone so even it silenced the room again, he said, "You can laugh at how I talk, ma'am, but that don't change what I came to say." And just like that, the moment passed. But the echo of it didn't. There was something about the way he stood there, alone, unshaken, that made the judge's bench feel smaller than it had a moment ago. And something about the silence in that room that sounded a lot like shame. Isaiah didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even blink. He just reached slowly into his folder and pulled out a weathered sheet of paper, encased in a clear plastic sleeve, yellowed by time, but preserved like something sacred. With the same steady gait that had carried him through droughts, funerals, and harvests, Isaiah walked to the bench. No drama. No rush. He placed the paper gently in front of Judge Rowe, then looked her in the eye and said, "Before you laugh again, maybe read what your grandfather once wrote about this land." The entire courtroom stilled. Judge Rowe's expression shifted, first confusion, then curiosity. She leaned forward, adjusted her reading glasses, and took the paper. It wasn't a legal document. No typed font, no court stamp, no case number. Just a letter, dated October 3rd, 1932, signed in deep black ink. And in the upper left corner, a faded Missouri state emblem, handwritten, precise, bold in its simplicity. At the bottom, the signature read, "Honor Hamilton Rowe, Judge, Claiborne County Circuit Court," her grandfather. She cleared her throat, perhaps out of habit, and read the words aloud. "To the citizens of Claiborne County, let it be remembered that no court, no office, and no law shall ever outweigh the dignity of those who earn their freedom by tending the land. When legal power forgets the moral debt owed to the soil-stained hands of working men, justice is no longer blind. It is cruel." A ripple moved through the room. Not a sound, just breath held all at once. Judge Rowe looked up, stiff, pale. Isaiah hadn't moved. He said calmly, "My great-granddaddy, Elijah Freeman, was your grandfather's court clerk. That's his handwriting, too. He helped him draft that letter when farmers were getting pushed off their land during the Depression. Colored farmers, mostly. It hit like a hammer dressed in velvet. The very legacy Judge Rowe stood upon. Her name, her bench, her reputation, had been shaped by a man who once defended people exactly like Isaiah. And now, nearly a century later, she had mocked one for speaking the same truth. The silence in the room deepened. So heavy, even the ceiling fans seemed to slow. No one spoke. The bailiff glanced at the judge, unsure. Naya looked at her father with something like awe. Even the high school interns had stopped taking notes. Isaiah returned to the podium, placed both hands on it, and said, "You thought my voice made me small, ma'am. But your grandfather didn't. He thought it mattered. He listened. He wrote it down, so others would remember." He paused. "Let it settle. Then, you wear his name. I carry his witness." Judge Rowe sat frozen. For once there was no sharp reply, no smirk, no gavel, only the weight of something ancient, not history in a book, but history looking back at her from a man in boots holding a truth she couldn't dismiss. In that moment, the courtroom didn't feel like law. It felt like legacy. And she was standing on the wrong side of it. For a few long seconds after Isaiah finished speaking, the courtroom sat in something deeper than silence. It was stillness, the kind that follows thunder. No gavel, no motion, just truth, floating in the air like dust in a beam of light. Judge Rowe didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The weight had already shifted. Isaiah returned to his seat, folded his hands, and said nothing more. But someone else had already said plenty, without uttering a word. In the back row, a 17-year-old high school senior named Marcus Dunn, there on a school field trip, had quietly pulled out his phone the moment the judge made her comment about the Southern Baptist Story Hour, and he hadn't stopped recording. The moment Isaiah laid that letter on the bench, the way the room froze, the words, "You wear his name, I carry his witness." He got it all. And an hour later, after school, he posted the 87-second clip to TikTok with the caption, "They tried to laugh at his voice. He made him remember his name." The video blew up before dinner. First, a few hundred views, then thousands, then millions. By the next morning, it had been shared across every major platform. The hashtags came fast. Respect the soil, I stand with Isaiah, voice like mine. Within 24 hours, people from across the country were weighing in. A retired school teacher in Ohio posted, "He sounded like my father. He planted truth, not just crops." A Vietnam vet in North Carolina said, "I didn't fight for fancy words. I fought for the kind of man who stands like that." A fifth-grade teacher in Mississippi printed Isaiah's line and taped it to her chalkboard, "You wear his name, I carry his witness." Civil rights organizations began tagging local news stations, demanding coverage. Church leaders shared the video in Sunday sermons. And in Atlanta, Reverend Calvin Stokes of New Mount Olive Baptist Church paused mid-sermon, played the clip for his congregation, then said, "You laughed at the voice of the field, not knowing it grew the country you now sit to judge." The crowd rose to their feet, not in outrage but in recognition, because they'd heard that voice before, in grandfathers, uncles, mothers who spoke truth in accents the world had tried to tune out. Even farmers in Iowa, Tennessee, and the Carolinas began posting videos from their fields, wearing overalls, holding handfuls of dirt, and saying into the camera, "We don't all sound the same, but we all feed the same nation." And in every post, Isaiah's calm stare, his simple defiance, became a symbol, not of resistance, but of reverence. Because the country wasn't just reacting to a courtroom moment. They were rallying behind a deeper truth, that dignity doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be heard. By Thursday morning, Isaiah's name was no longer just on a docket. It was in headlines, sermons, group chats. But to him, it was still just a case, still just the land. He was back on the farm, fixing a broken fence post near the east field when a silver sedan pulled up the long gravel road. A tall woman in a navy suit stepped out, heels dusty within seconds, but her stride unbroken. She didn't introduce herself with a business card. She just looked him in the eye and said, "Mr. Freeman, my name's Amari Bennett. I'd like to help you keep your land." Isaiah squinted into the sunlight. Didn't say yes, didn't say no, just nodded once and kept hammering. Later on the porch, they sat with 2 glasses of lemonade. Helen hovered nearby, arms crossed, reading the woman like a lawyer reads fine print. Amari was 42, Harvard-educated, raised in Birmingham, and known in legal circles for tearing down city ordinances with nothing but a voice and a binder full of facts. But she didn't come in swinging, she came in listening. Still, Isaiah didn't warm easily. He stared at the folder she placed on the table, full of case precedents and property law, and said, "I've spoken for myself all my life. I don't need someone to dress up my voice." Amari didn't flinch. She sipped her lemonade, leaned forward and replied, "Then let me help them hear it louder." That's when something shifted. Isaiah didn't need a savior. He needed a megaphone. And Amari? She'd built her career making courtrooms echo. Over the next 48 hours, they worked side by side. Naya joined them, digging through records from the county archive, digital land maps, scanned deeds from the 1890s. What they found was damning. The proposed community development was mapped over Isaiah's land before the county ever notified him. Signatures on a zoning approval form appeared digitally replicated. Property boundary lines were altered in a developer-submitted survey that didn't match the state's archival map. It was more than a mistake. It was a pattern. By Saturday morning, Amari had drafted a formal motion to remove Judge Rowe from the case, on the grounds of demonstrated bias, ethical misconduct, and irreparable harm to judicial neutrality. She didn't mince words. Attached to the motion were a transcript of Judge Rowe's mocking comment, the 1932 letter from her own grandfather, a petition with more than 300,000 signatures, a notarized affidavit from a retired land surveyor confirming the map fraud. Still, Isaiah remained grounded. He said little, read every word of the motion twice, then placed a hand on the yellowed envelope that held his family's deed and said quietly, "This ain't about winning with words. It's about making sure the ones who came before me don't get erased again." Amari nodded. "Then we won't beg for justice," she said. "We'll demand it, on paper, in court, and loud enough for everyone to hear." Monday morning didn't feel like a typical court day. It felt heavier, like the air knew something was about to shift. By sunrise, people were already lining up outside the Claiborne County Courthouse. Some wore Sunday suits. Some came in dusty boots. Some carried nothing but their convictions. They'd driven in from Kansas, Georgia, Arkansas, drawn by something deeper than a headline. They came not just for Isaiah Freeman, but for what he stood on, and what he stood for. Inside, the courtroom brimmed with tension. The gallery was packed, not with spectators but witnesses, of truth, of change, of reckoning. Isaiah sat at the front, still in his old flannel and boots, a man unchanged by attention. Beside him, Amari Bennett laid her files on the table with quiet precision. Naya sat a few rows behind them, gripping her notebook like it held more than notes, like it held her grandmother's prayers. And then the door opened. Judge Madeline Rowe entered. Same robe, same tight bun, same posture of control. But something had changed. This time when she stepped behind the bench, no one stood. She tapped her gavel once. "This court is now in session," she said, but the words didn't land the same. They floated in the room like smoke, visible, but empty. Amari stood. Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "Your Honor," she began, "we respectfully move for your recusal from this case on the grounds of demonstrated bias, public misconduct, and a breach of judicial ethics." Judge Rowe raised her eyebrows. "And what evidence supports such an extraordinary claim?" she asked. Amari took a breath, not for drama, but for control. "The evidence," she said, "begins with your own words, recorded and circulated, mocking my client's voice in open court. It continues with a letter, handwritten by your own grandfather, Judge Hamilton Rowe, which directly contradicts the attitude and conduct you displayed here. And it ends," she added, "with over 300,000 signatures from citizens across this country demanding your withdrawal, because the people recognize what dignity sounds like, even when the law forgets." Judge Rowe stiffened in her chair. "This court does not yield to social media outcry," she said sharply. Amari didn't flinch. "Then perhaps it should yield to something older than social media," she replied, "to the first code of judicial conduct, that a judge shall act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary." The gallery fell still. Even the ceiling fans seemed to pause. Then Isaiah stood. He didn't point, didn't shout. He just spoke, with the calm gravity of a man who'd carried more than his share of silence. "You didn't just laugh at my accent, ma'am. You laughed at my grandfather's boots. You laughed at my father's calloused hands. You laughed at the kitchen table my mother scrubbed clean every Sunday before church. You laughed at every person who ever worked land they didn't inherit but earned anyway." He paused. "I came here to speak. You turned it into a performance, but that stage doesn't belong to you anymore." For the first time since she'd taken the bench, Judge Rowe didn't speak. Her eyes scanned the crowd. What she saw wasn't anger. It was disappointment. It was the reflection of her own name through a lens she had not expected to face. And then she stood. She removed her glasses, closed her folder, and without a word, walked off the bench. The chamber door clicked shut behind her like the final period in a sentence she hadn't wanted to write. No one applauded. No one cheered. But one by one, the courtroom stood. Not for Isaiah, not for Amari, but for something else entirely. For respect. For justice reclaimed in silence. 2 days after Judge Rowe left the bench, a new name appeared on the docket. Judge David Kinley. White. Late 60s. Former defense attorney. A man with a quiet reputation for respecting the law as much as the people it was written to protect. He'd spent 30 years defending family farms against corporate seizures, and quietly turned down every interview request since. He wasn't a man of flair. He was a man of facts. And this time, the courthouse felt different. No cameras, no chants, just rows of quiet people, waiting to see if truth could still stand without applause. When Judge Kinley entered, the room rose, not because of his robe but because of his record. He nodded once and took his seat. "Let's proceed," he simply. Amari stood. Her tone was measured. No sharpness, no fire, just clarity. She began by presenting a certified copy of the original land deed from 1891, showing Elijah Freeman's purchase, signed, sealed, and notarized. Then she submitted a topographical map dated 1910, reflecting the original boundaries of the Freeman property. And finally she called her witness, Walter Green, a retired land surveyor who had worked for the county for 35 years. Mr. Green walked slowly to the stand, leaned gently into the microphone, and said, "The map used by the developer, it's been altered." He pointed to key changes, shifting lines, duplicated digital signatures, and date stamps that didn't match the county's record-keeping practices. It wasn't just sloppy, he added. It was intentional. Judge Kinley listened without interrupting. Then he turned to the defense attorney, now visibly pale. He asked plainly, "Do you have any evidence Mr. Freeman ever sold or surrendered this land, in part or in whole, to any agency or company?" The attorney hesitated, cleared his throat. "No, Your Honor." Judge Kinley leaned forward just slightly. "Then tell me, why was this case brought forward under the claim of eminent domain?" No one answered, because the answer was obvious and ugly. The room held its breath. Then came the ruling, delivered with no theatrics, no flourish, and no delay. This court recognizes Mr. Isaiah Freeman's full legal claim to his property. The land in question remains his, uncontested, unencumbered, and fully protected under state and federal law. He paused. Furthermore, this court refers all submitted documentation from the Claiborne County Development Office and the named private developer to the Missouri State Attorney General for immediate review under potential fraud and misconduct. Isaiah didn't smile. He didn't sigh. He just closed his eyes for a moment. Maybe to pray. Maybe to remember. Maybe just to feel what justice sounded like. When it wasn't whispered, but spoken with finality. Amari rested a hand gently on his arm. Naya leaned forward, tears filling her eyes, not from relief, but from recognition. What had been taken for granted was now set in stone. And this time, the gavel didn't fall like a sentence. It fell like a restoration. Isaiah didn't speak to the press. He didn't sit for interviews, didn't pose for pictures. He just packed up the folder, tipped his hat to Judge Kinley, and walked out of that courthouse the same way he walked in, steady, quiet, with his dignity intact. By the time he got home, the late sun was already casting long gold streaks across the soybean rows. Helen was waiting on the porch, hands on her hips, her apron dusted with flour. He nodded to her once, said nothing. She didn't ask how it went. She already knew. Later that evening, under the old oak tree at the west edge of the field, the one that had stood longer than any title deed, Isaiah brought out a weathered wooden pole. Helen followed behind, holding something wrapped in cloth. They raised it together, not a flag from a store, but one Helen had sewn herself. From her father's Korean War uniform and the silk handkerchief she carried on their wedding day. Stars cut from worn navy, stripes stitched by hand, threaded not just with fabric, but with memory. When it caught the wind, it didn't flap with ceremony. It waved like it had been there all along. People started coming the next morning. No announcement, no invitation. They came in quiet trucks, on foot, in borrowed cars. Some brought peach cobbler. Others left handwritten prayers folded into fence wire. One woman drove 6 hours just to place a jar of soil from her grandmother's farm beneath the oak. Another left a single sunflower tied in twine, with a note that read, "For every voice that was once too soft to be heard." A few days later, a retired judge from Oklahoma arrived. He didn't ask to speak to Isaiah. He just walked up to the porch, nodded politely to Helen, and left a leather-bound book on the step. Inside, on the first page, in clean blue ink, he'd written, "Never seen a defense clearer or quieter." Judge R. Maddox, 1974-2006. Isaiah didn't read it right away. He was back out in the barn, fixing a latch that had never sat straight, because the land still needed tending. And some victories don't ask for celebration. They ask for continuation. Weeks passed. The headlines faded, but the echo didn't. What happened inside that quiet courtroom in Claiborne County began to ripple into places Isaiah would never see and into lives he'd never meet. In a public high school just outside Springfield, Missouri, a civics teacher wheeled in a projector and played the video. Not the edited clip. The full courtroom exchange. Start to finish. She paused the video at the moment Isaiah said, "You didn't just laugh at my accent, you laughed at my grandfather's boots." The room was silent. Then from the back, a teenage boy, freckles, baseball cap turned backward, raised his hand. "Why'd she laugh at him?" he asked. "Was it just the way he talked?" The teacher looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and wrote, "Sometimes power doesn't fear knowledge, it fears clarity." She turned back to the class and said, "He wasn't soft-spoken. He was sharply spoken, and some folks only know how to respond to noise, not truth." That clip of her writing on the board, it went viral too. Within a month, several school districts in Missouri, Georgia, and Ohio added Isaiah's story to their curriculum on property rights, regional bias, and civic courage. Law professors at the University of Missouri invited Amari Bennett to guest lecture on precedent, but also on presence. She held up the same letter Isaiah placed on the bench and said, "This isn't just history, it's a mirror, and sometimes it reflects who's really wearing the robe." Outside the Claiborne County Courthouse, a bronze plaque was installed at the base of the stairs. It wasn't ordered by any government official. It was funded by thousands of small donations, farmers, teachers, welders, pastors, students. On the plaque were Isaiah's words, etched deep into metal. "You didn't just laugh at my accent, you laughed at my grandfather's hands." Isaiah Freeman, 2024. Beneath it, a second line, a place where dignity was tested and answered. There was a dedication ceremony. People came from 7 states. Isaiah didn't attend. But the next morning, just before sunrise, he drove out early, coat collar turned up against the wind. He parked quietly, walked to the edge of the courthouse lawn, and stood in front of the plaque. Didn't touch it, didn't kneel, just stood, hands in his coat pockets, looking, remembering. Helen had slipped a thermos of coffee into his truck before he left. He took a sip now, standing there in the cold. Then just before he turned to go, he whispered to the bronze, "Let him laugh next time." A pause. "We'll still be standing." And with that, Isaiah Freeman walked back to his truck, toward the road, toward the field, toward the life that had never once needed applause to feel complete. If this story moved you even just a little, take a moment. Because what Isaiah Freeman stood for wasn't just land. It was dignity. It was the idea that your voice matters, even when it's soft, even when it's different, especially when it's been overlooked for too long. This was never just about a courtroom. It was about generations, about memory, about knowing where you come from, and having the courage to speak for it when it matters most. If this story spoke to you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hit that subscribe button to follow more powerful stories like this from Mr. Max Stories. Your support means the world to us. It's what keeps this channel going and what gives us the heart to keep telling stories that honor truth, justice, and everyday courage. Thanks for being here. And remember, no matter who tries to laugh at your voice, you're still standing.